International world-famous archaeologist, explorer, and author. He has traveled the world to gather data on ancient mysteries and published more than 30 books and videos, written several hundred papers, hosted newspaper columns, appeared on numerous television and radio shows worldwide, and lectures to audiences on every continent. Over the past 37 years, he has penetrated some largely unexplored areas, including parts of the Amazon headwaters. He has also led expeditions to the bottom of the sea and to remote mountain and desert regions of the world. His findings include evidence of ancient Egyptians in the Americas, remains of ancient giants on a remote Pacific island, and of Egyptian chariot parts and skeletal remains scattered over the seabed. Now, this approach has propelled him to the forefront of little-known discoveries that shake traditional theories of our past. In the course of his explorations, Jonathan began to uncover evidence of surprising out-of-place artifacts that should not exist. These artifacts were found on a global pattern, and they suggest an ancient worldwide civilization of astonishing proportions. His book, Dead Men's Secrets, catalogs more than 1,000 pieces of evidence of a lost super science and technology, including dozens of achievements ahead of our day. His other books include Lost World of Giants, The Weapon the Globalists Fear, and 64 Secrets Still Ahead of Us. And I understand that his new book, The Forbidden Secret, is in the production stages and is actually available in that part of the world, which is, I think, New Zealand and Australia, and will soon be available around the rest of the world as well and available on the internet. Jonathan, thank you very much for agreeing to come on at such short notice and be our guest again on The Bright Side. How are you, sir?
Very, very well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have you back. I don't know how many of the people listening heard the original interview, so we're just going to start again from scratch. And one of the things I really want to start with is, now, you've been doing this for 37 years, and of course, I suppose as all the rest of us, you know, you've been given a traditional history of the world and how we started off as cavemen and then how we gradually advanced into modern technologies, the industrial age, etc. But something along the lines, when you were studying archaeology, something changed your perception of that and got you started off on your road. Can you take us back to that point?
Yes, I'd be happy to. As I researched, it took me to over 30 countries, and I began to see things that I'd never even heard about, which should not even exist. And the first one, I just pushed it aside, thought, well, this is an anomaly. It can't be explained at this moment, but maybe one of these days. But the more I researched, the more of these out-of-place artifacts and out-of-place evidences began to surface, until it became quite an avalanche. It was impossible to keep pushing these aside and still be honest with the evidence I was dealing with. So I stopped what I was doing. That book was cancelled totally, and I had to start from scratch, and I realised now that the world had to hear about this because it would place a completely different slant upon all of the history we'd been taught.
Let me ask you a question. That first book that you were starting on that you had to scrap, what was that going to be about?
It was going to be a traditional history book, but a history of the civilizations of the world.
No kidding. Wow. Okay. And you decided it. Now, when you took that trip into the Amazon, I believe, the first trip that you took, was that during the course of writing the book? Was that afterwards? Or
that was before.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't place much value upon what I saw in the Amazon at that time in relation to what I'm doing now, because I was not expecting it to have any value. What I did see was Egyptian metal hieroglyphics, metal plates, or a metal plate to start with, more came up later, but a metal plate with Egyptian hieroglyphics on it, which had been traded across the Atlantic Ocean to native tribes that now inhabited the Amazon. And so this was evidence, really, and as I mentioned, I didn't really think about it too much at the time, but later when I began to find these other anomalies cropping up, I realised then the significance of this, that Egyptians had actually visited South America and traded with the South Americans long ago when South Americans had shining cities, and before their ancestors actually had to go bush through earthquakes and so on, and today their descendants still hold these relics.
So, okay, so now the Egyptians were actually navigating the oceans of the world. How long ago was this?
It would be around about 2000 BC to probably 1500 BC.
That's not very long ago. I mean, is there any evidence? Because, I mean, I certainly know from my understanding of ancient history that there's nothing written in the history books that would give us any indication to believe that the Egyptians traveled that far.
No, that's very true. Our knowledge of Egyptian history goes back probably to 1000 BC. Our clear knowledge of the Egyptian history is not that clear. But then the history of Egypt is the type of history that we read about after Egypt had lost its highest technology and after many of the secrets of pyramid building and electrical matters and so on were lost. We have evidence that the Egyptians had a very high civilization, much higher than what's taught in the history books. But we're dealing in the history books today with, in the school history books and university books, with the latter history of Egypt, not the earlier history. That was more sophisticated.
Okay, so you say the Egyptians traveled, and so then if they came as far as South America, then they must have probably as well landed in North America, you think?
Oh, yes, most likely they did. In fact, I believe there's good evidence that has been found in North America of Egyptian presence. And also they went down to the south. There's evidence that one Egyptian explorer came back from the southern hemisphere to Egypt and brought an animal that was able to hop around. It was a kangaroo, and the Egyptians recorded this.
Where is this information recorded?
It's recorded actually on some of the monuments of the tombs of different pharaohs. Events such as this. This is just one event. Recorded by the pharaohs of events during their lifetime.
Ah, okay. So now, all right, so let's talk a bit about the Egyptians then. What else can you tell us about what was going on in terms of the Egyptians technologically? Because, I mean, they created, of course, they built the pyramids. Now, do you believe that they built the pyramids, and do you believe that the pyramids were built with slave labor, people dragging the blocks along up ramps?
Well, it's interesting that yes and no. The latter part of Egyptian history, after the technology deteriorated, we have evidence of pyramids being built in a more primitive method. We actually have that on the walls of one of the pharaohs who wrote what was happening in his day, and that was a much smaller pyramid, very, very small. But there's evidence that the Egyptians were aware of sound waves and that they recorded that the huge lifting of mighty blocks was done not with slaves, not with pulleys, not with ramps, but rather by the use of sound waves. And sound wave technology was apparently something that was global in its knowledge in the past. Egypt was just one country that used it.
Yes, I've heard about that before, actually. I mean, that I've heard about, and that would certainly account for a lot of the huge monolithic structures, the huge stones like at Baalbek and also down in South America as well, that are tons and tons, weigh tons and tons that we could not even possibly lift today. Now, this is the thing. Because I know that from what I understand, from what I've read, and from maybe part of our conversation before, how did we get so advanced and then end up devolving so? I mean, where did this knowledge come from?
Well, it's very interesting. In my research, I was struck by the similarity between Egyptian civilization, the Indus Valley civilization in what is today Pakistan, and in the Sumerian civilization in what is now Iraq. And it's interesting that these three civilizations suddenly appeared out of nowhere. in each case, there's no indication of evolving from a primitive beginning. But in the case of Egypt, in particular, which we're talking about right now, and it's true of the others as well, the highest technology and the highest scientific knowledge was at the beginning, not later. It did not develop from there. Therefore, it does suggest that the fact that these civilizations began round about the same time as each other, they suddenly sprang up, the three of them, suggests they had a common, what shall we say, trigger that triggered the rise of these civilizations. Now, when we get to the...
What would that trigger be? Would you have any theory or idea within yourself as to what that trigger would have been?
Yes, I certainly do now. And I believe it can be substantiated, David, that there was a great disaster, that worldwide civilizations globally had a memory of what they called the Great Flood. In fact, it's the most widespread memory of the human race. We've got over 600 reports handed down independently across the world of this event. Now, they all state that it was global, that most of the human race was wiped out, and that it began again. The Middle East was the re-establishment point of the New World, and this would account for Egypt, Sumeria, and Indus Valley being the closest to that centre and being the first civilizations to arise after the disaster. But of course, they couldn't just arise. You'd need enough people, and it would take a few generations, several hundred years, before there were enough people, no matter what knowledge they had preserved, before they could establish a culture. It takes people to do it, even if you've got the knowledge. One family couldn't do it on their own.
Now, that civilization, that antediluvian civilization, are you one of the believers in Atlantis? Do you believe it was Atlantis, or do you believe it came from somewhere else? And where do you believe Atlantis was?
Well, Atlantis, what I do accept, of course, is that where there is smoke, there's fire. Where there's a legend, there has to be a core of truth.
Okay.
And,
good way to
and
look
some
at it.
people call it Atlantis. And we do have a story about a place called Atlantis, which came to us fourth hand. It was not a first-hand report. And during that handing down, I do believe that a lot of details became garbled, and there were changes made to the story. And one of these changes was the length of time between the report and the alleged event. Now, also another change was the size of Atlantis. I'm open, actually, as I know a lot of other researchers who are looking at all the facts are open to the fact that Atlantis could be either pre-flood or post-flood, depending upon how you interpret the story.
Well, if it's post-flood, then if it's post-flood, then that means we have to still find a civilization that was pre-flood. So, I mean, in order for all of the, because, I mean, I know that a lot of people do feel that, we had the extraterrestrial jump start, and I know a lot of people don't. But my question would simply be, where would all of this advancement, this advanced technology, where would this knowledge come from?
That's a very good question. We have the oldest record of the pre-flood world is in the book of Genesis. A lot of people, of course, don't believe the book of Genesis, but archaeological research is confirming it as literally acceptable. And in the book of Genesis, it states that there was an industrial revolution which took place about 300 years before the Great Disaster.
Okay.
And that not only was metallurgy mastered, but also there were schools of metallurgy. And there was a very high civilization wiped out at the time of the Great Flood. Okay.
And so that's great civilization then migrated into various places. You said the Indus Valley, Sumeria, of course, Egypt, and then they would have somehow ended up in the Americas as the Mayans, and the Olmecs as well, I would suppose.
That is right, yes. From the Middle East, they went west, and they found the Americas at a very early stage.
Okay. Interesting. Now, All right, so let's go back to the Egyptians again. So now we have these high civilizations, and apparently very high. Give me examples. Now we talked just a little bit already about Egypt. Let's cover a few more examples of their superior technology, just to give a clear indication to our listeners as to how technologically advanced they were than us.
Well, yes. For example, here's something that we have by inference rather than by evidence, but I think it's so interesting and it's so valid that we ought to mention it first.
Okay.
Whenever you go into the old buildings of medieval Europe, you see smoke on the ceilings of these buildings, the ones that are still standing. And this is naturally because smoke sources for light were used, lamps, oil lamps or candles and so on.
Right.
Now today we don't have that. You look up your ceiling where you are now, and I and mine, and we use electric lights, and we don't have smoke on the ceilings. It's
right.
a non-smoking source of light. You go to the older buildings in not just Egypt but Asia and other places, and you will find the oldest places where there is evidence that man has lived and where he's painted beautiful paintings, particularly in Egypt, where they go inside mountains and places where sunlight could never reach. But you would need something like sunlight to execute these beautiful paintings. You couldn't do it any other way. And there's no smoke on the ceilings. No smoke whatsoever.
We're talking... Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, this does tell us that they had a smokeless source of light.
And not even caverns. I don't even want to use that word. I want to use the word rooms. And tunnels that are hundreds of rooms and tunnels many, many feet beneath the earth. Are we not talking about places like that?
Oh, yes, we certainly are. And mirrors have been... modern researchers have tried to use reflection by a series of mirrors from daylight into the interiors, but it's not adequate. It doesn't work.
I couldn't even imagine it working at a certain point in time. So there's no known actual artifact that points to the fact clearly that they had, say, electrical lights, or is there?
No, we do not have artifacts, but we do have written records. We have many, many written records about lights that would go on and off automatically as people opened and shut doors and as they approached or left a certain area. And, of course, that does fit with what we have reinvented in our day. We have lights which are heat-sensitive and so on that come on and off, and we have the electrical charges that can open doors and shut doors and put lights on, take them off by remote control. It appears that in Egypt they must have had that. There are so many reports of it, and they're all in agreement on that.
Well, that's actually pretty amazing, just in light of what, I know myself, I was always a fan of ancient Egyptian history, and it never crossed my mind, to think, well, gee, how did they paint these walls, or in these tunnels and even in these tombs, how did they get it, you just, it don't cross your mind, but then when you really put your thoughts to it and you think about it, you realize, particularly now that I'm listening to you and other archaeologists have said the same thing, there are no smudge marks on the ceiling. It's obvious that they had something that they were using that didn't leave any traces of smoke or smudge and allowed them to do these highly intricate paintings, and they are highly intricate. So they must have had something. What else? Now let's slide projector. Tell us about the slide projector.
Yes, well, this is a very interesting one. In some of the temples, they had an effect which is absolutely astonishing in relation to what we would expect them to do today, and we would not think it possible that they could do this. But in Egypt, the religion of Nimrod, the mystery religion of Nimrod and Semiramis was carried on, and it was a religion that was outlawed for a while until it became strong enough to take over.
You're saying that in Egypt, you're saying that, not in Samaria.
In Egypt, yes. It
Okay.
actually became a global worship ultimately under different names. But in Egypt, originally, a monotheism prevailed, as it did in all countries at the beginning. This is just the opposite from what we've been taught.
Okay. That is very interesting.
But as religion deteriorated, and the Nimrod Semiramis Babylonian was actually a copy, a counterfeit of purer religion, which defaced it and deformed it. And of course, it was very cruel. It was sexually orientated and human sacrifice orientated eventually.
Right.
But the priests were, what I'm trying to get to is this, that there was a lot of deception in it, and the purpose of the slide projectors was to deceive the initiates. Mm-hmm. But that will explain why they did it, but let me explain how they did it. It's very, very interesting.
Okay.
Now, the mysteries had to do with the worship of a dead man, Nimrod. He was given different names like Osiris and so on.
Right.
And there were ceremonies in these mysteries that were designed to scare the worshippers. And then Nimrod was introduced to soothe them so they would come to revere or love him. But this was a very clever psychological ploy. And in these mysteries, under the seal of secrecy and under the sanction of an oath, and by means of all the fertile resources of technology, as well as some magic, men were gradually led back to the worship of this man that had been publicly suppressed earlier. And then new features were added that made it very, very, very clever. Now, the idea was to wind up in the minds of the novices a high pitch of excitement, so that after they'd surrendered themselves implicitly to the priest, they'd be prepared to receive and do anything that they asked. Mm-hmm. Now, after the candidates had passed through their confessional and sworn the required oath, strange and amazing objects presented themselves. Sometimes the place they were in would shake around them, and sometimes it would appear bright and resplendent with light. And then it would again go back into darkness. And sometimes there was thunder and lightning inside the buildings, with great noises and bellowings and apparitions. Mm-hmm. And the spectators were absolutely terrified.
Of course.
But then the great god, the central object of their worship, Nimrod, was revealed to them in a way that was fitted to soothe their feelings and attract their blind affections. Now I'll explain the technology.
Okay.
But I think it's interesting to get the background of this and why it was used.
Okay.
Now, there was seen on the wall of the temple, this was the anticlimax after they'd gone through all those terrifying experiences. On the wall of the temple, a massive light that appeared at first at a very great distance. And we have an actual description recorded in ancient Egyptian history of this event. And in the light is transformed, he says, while unfolding itself. Now, this is translated into English from the actual Egyptian writings. Uh-huh. The light is transformed while unfolding itself into a visage evidently divine, of an aspect severe, but with a touch of sweetness. Mm. Now, the method the priests employed was known as phantasmagoria. Now, that's a big word, I know, but what it means is a slide projection.
Right, you create a phantom somehow. So somehow they created a phantom of some sort, which...
That is right.
Right, okay.
And the projector was arranged to be moved forward and from the screen, like we have with television cameras today, and at the same time it was kept in focus, and the optical effect was that the figures on a screen appeared to dwindle into the distance or to rush toward the observer with a great speed.
Clever.
And you can imagine, in the hands of crafty, scheming men, this was a very powerful means of imposing the will upon the people.
Well, quite honestly, if these people had the ability to build those pyramids, you can't really, what else can you put beyond them? I mean, obviously, it would make some sense that they would have other technology that would be just as astounding. Now, let's move away from Egypt for a minute and let's go to some of the other civilizations, particularly the Indus Valley. And we haven't even talked about China yet, which we need to find out some of the stuff that's going on over there as well. But what about the Indus Valley that was astounding, and what can we get out of the Indus Valley to indicate the high technology that they had back then?
Okay, in the Indus Valley, we have evidence of the most meticulous town planning. All the streets being on a grill system, north to south, east to west, showing that they had compass points that they built everything upon. Now, under the streets were all paved. They weren't just mud streets, like we think they might be. They were paved streets, and from each house there was a toilet system, a flush toilet system that went into a city sewer.
That's amazing. Okay, that is amazing.
Of course, they had these in other countries too, but that's one of the first things that strikes you as you go to Mohenjo-Daro, for example, one of the cities of the Indus Valley civilization. And it's believed that this may have been the first post-flood city that excelled 1 million people for population.
Now, is this not the city that was destroyed by a radiation blast, or not?
The evidence does suggest that the city was destroyed that way, yes.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that is a highly advanced weapon for them to have had in their hands at that time.
Yes, most certainly. We also go to records of that general area which are still preserved, speaking of two nations at war, in which one nation warned the other to get out, all the people get out of the city because a missile was coming to destroy it within 7 days, and they had 7 days warning to leave. And I'm not sure whether we mentioned this last time we were talking, but there have been found in the city square buildings that have been heated from above, in which the buildings themselves melted with the heat. This is the kind of thing that happens with atomic radiation.
Mm-hmm.
And people were found which are today still radioactive, tremendously radioactive. In one case that I love to mention because it does provide a human interest factor to something that to many people might be rather boring. That is, among the people found in the city square, flattened to the ground but still radioactive, there's a skeleton of a man and a woman and a child all holding hands. Oh dear. They did not get out in time.
Okay, well, that one just made it very, very sort of human, not just a story, but that sort of brought a little emotional touch to it, and made it very current. Well, okay, so the Indus Valley has that, and let's now Samaria, of course. A lot of people feel that Samaria was the first civilization, that the other civilizations came from Samaria. I know you're not a fan of, Sitchin and his interpretations of the cuneiform writings, and of course the Anunnaki and Nibiru. But what can you tell us about Samaria that made it so outstanding at that time?
Well, the Sumerian civilization, of course, is right there in Iraq, where Babylon later on grew up. And the evidence is, of course, that Samaria and Egypt and Indus Valley arose about the same time. There's hardly any difference. It would have been the same lifetime, even if not the same years necessarily, but within the same lifetime these three arose. Now, the Sumerian civilization is noted for quite a number of things, not the smallest of which is the huge building operations. And part of the Sumerian civilization extended along the Fertile Crescent, and today we have good evidence of the size of the building blocks they were able to lift. And when we go to places like Baalbek, where we have blocks of stone, for example, which are lifted up to 20 feet above the ground, and the size of these stones is not 2 tons, not 20 tons, not 200 tons, but 2,000 tons in weight, lifted 20 feet above the ground. today we do not have any cranes or combination of cranes that could lift it that way. And I believe this can be substantiated by engineers and those who have studied the situation. That here we have blocks of stone that we don't know how they did it. And of course, you mentioned sound waves earlier, and I would have to go along with that, perhaps, as being a possibility.
It seems very practical, for sure. I certainly know the gentleman, I say practical as if it's something that I can do, but practical as something that's scientific and something that someone who has studied it and who knows how to create those waves can do. I know about the gentleman down in Florida who several years back created the Coral Palace, well, several years back, I guess maybe around the turn of the century, and credited that to sound waves, lifting those heavy blocks and positioning them. Now, you're saying that Baalbek was a part of the Sumerian legacy?
Yeah, it was connected with the Sumerian legacy, yes. It wasn't central Sumeria as such, but the Sumerians actually were very practical people. They were a group of people who were not interested in truth for truth's sake, unless it had a practical value. The Egyptians were like that as well. In other words, unless it had a practical value in their everyday life, they were not particularly careful about the details of how they related something, and so they are noted for their fiction writing. And that's a very interesting feature we've got to be careful about when we try to take everything that they write literally. They were also quite...
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say we have to be careful about that today, too. That's all. Actually. But anyway, go ahead. Seems to be a human trait throughout the ages.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And we have certain scholars who've made a name for themselves by taking everything that they write literally and interpreting it as though it was a real story. But when you start to examine and analyse, that all of this has now been translated into English, and so we can analyse it quite easily. It's evident here that there's a lot of hyperbole and a lot of imagination going into their stories, and it's not reliable historical fact. There are other libraries that have been found which give us a much better view of the truth of the times than what the Sumerians left behind for us.
Okay, so then to jump ahead really quickly then, so you're not a fan of the fact that according to a lot of people, Nibiru is apparently approaching the planet.
No, well, I'm not going to say that we don't have flybys. What I'm saying is that Nibiru is not the name of any such flyby. Nibiru was simply another name given to the planet Jupiter.
Okay.
But Sumerians gave it to the planet Jupiter, which is always visible, but to no other heavenly body in the heavens. And we do have their libraries today, and we have their dictionaries, so it's easy now to analyse what they were saying about this.
So let me just ask you this, and this is actually for the people that are listening, this is for my own, this is truly one of my own questions, but you're saying that Sitchin is no longer the only person that has access to what the cuneiform writings are saying then, or that he, that there are...
Yes, that is true, and it's interesting that the Sitchins, I said Sitchin, but I meant, I've got a little book out now called Sitchin Fiction, but... Sitchin, with due respect, I mean, I've corresponded with this gentleman. I've read his book, so he had some very good material in it, but his theories about what goes on in the heavens are totally out of step with the truth of the Sumerian writings, what they even did say. I mean, they wrote a lot of fiction, but the fact is, when they did write fact, what Sitchin has interpreted is not what they wrote. His meanings of words are not at all in harmony with the dictionaries they've left behind. Mm-hmm. Now, it's only recently that Sumerian dictionaries have been made available to us, and 3 universities in the world now have these accessible, and they've put them on the net for us. So anyone can check this up. That the word meanings given by our friend Zechariah Sitchin, not one of those word meanings corresponds to the actual meanings of the names. In my opinion, it was all made up.
Well, that's deep. There are a lot of Sitchin believers out there. I just want to take a minute also to say to the listeners, the people that are listening live, feel free to call in, say within the next 23 minutes, and ask your questions of our guest, Jonathan Gray. He'll be happy to talk with you. Please use the number that's there on the Bright Side show page. It is toll free. And as I said before, we definitely are happy to have you call in and ask your questions. Now, let's leave the Sumerians alone for a minute. Let's jump over to the New World, to the Mayans. What kind of familiarity do you have with some of the high technological advances that they had?
Well, the Mayans were absolutely wonderful with their study of the stars and the sky. But they were probably the world's very, very best on that. And they had telescopes. We have good evidence of that. They had a knowledge of the calendar which is more accurate than ours is today, than our modern calendar.
So do you give credence? Yeah, I'm sorry.
I beg your pardon?
I was going to say, do you give credence then to their 2012 prediction because of that?
Well, the interesting thing is that the New Age movement has seized on the year 2012 as being a big event, but this was not a big event to the Mayan. All it was in the Mayan calendar was, let's put it in a simple way. Every month the moon gets back to the same spot in relation to the Earth. It takes a month. That's where we get the month from, for the moon to encircle the Earth. It takes our planet 365 and a quarter days to circle the sun. That's right, isn't it, roughly? Mm-hmm. And then it takes our solar system 25,000 years to circle, to do our cycle around our Milky Way galaxy. Mm-hmm. Now, these are normal cycles that have no special events attached to them. And then the Mayan broke that up into 5 cycles of 5,000. And they looked at the beginnings and endings of cycles because of their accuracy in astronomy. They calculated that in the year 2012, our solar system would be crossing the equator of the Milky Way. And so they said that's a convenient spot, a very logical spot to end a calendar. And then they extrapolated back from the beginning from the end of that calendar to give it a beginning. And the most recent beginning would have been 3,112 or thereabouts BC. And so that gave them a 5,000-year cycle. But there was no prediction of world destruction or anything. It was simply an astronomical cycle that would repeat itself. There were larger cycles, longer cycles, shorter cycles, and that's all there was to it as far as the Maya were concerned.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other let's talk about some of the technological advances maybe in your end of the world. Now, Easter Island, obviously I think that's probably been one of the places that you visited. What can you tell us about what you saw there and the construction of those stones, maybe how they were created, the statues, the moai? What can you tell us?
Well, it's very wonderful. Those people also had the ability to lift large weights, and if we think that they just carried they cut these big stones in the quarry and then transported them by slaves or pulleys or ramps to where they had to go, just forget it. They did that no more than the Egyptians did it. They had an ability which was great. You've got them taking from the quarry. We know where the quarries are on Easter Island, and they carried huge stones, hundreds of tons in weight, across the island, and then they lowered them down onto ledges halfway down cliffs facing out to the ocean. These stones were impossible to go across the island the way we have imagined, simply because they had left no traces of the rocks having been, of the ground having been worn away or scraped. They had the same technology as the rest of the world did back in those days. These people were very smart.
Do you think they had a common communication system?
Oh, yes, I certainly do. As a matter of fact, in ancient times, we do have records of what we would today call probably cell phones.
Aha. Okay, I'm laughing. No, seriously.
we have records left from us from the first century of a man called Eusebius, for example. He said, I love speaking with my friends far away. He says, I carry this little gadget around hanging on my neck like a necklace. And he said, we can talk to each other, even though there's many days' travel between us.
Okay. Well, what happened to the human race then? What happened if indeed these technologies were present in our history? What happened? How did we fall so far from having that kind of knowledge to where we entered the Dark Ages and then had to climb back out with almost a whole different kind of knowledge? What happened in your estimation?
That's a fair enough question. Disasters, both man-made and natural. There have been tremendous earthquakes, and I think probably earthquakes would be the best example of natural disasters. And earthquakes can raise land and sink land very quickly as well. I noticed that they say Japan has moved 8 inches through the earthquake this week. Yes,
indeed. And that's a whole pole shift. I don't know if it's the magnetic pole or whatever, but there's been a change as well in that. So, go ahead.
So changes can come very suddenly, and we don't even know it. The rest of the world wouldn't know about it. In fact, land has risen 2,000 feet overnight in South America. We've got the city of, I'm deviating here a little bit, but we've got the city of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, which was a seaport. But now it's 12,000 feet above sea level. And that happened pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I heard that people who climb to the top of Mount Everest find sand. So
Yes, they do. And water creatures.
Yeah.
Sea creatures.
Yeah. So, that's a little unnerving, really, because, as we see, and I know I'm deviating now too, but as we see with what happened in Japan, change can come at a drastic level right away. I mean, take a group of people, a town, a nation, a country, a landmass by surprise, and alter everything. So you think that had something to do then with how we can, fall so far technologically?
I would think that would be one contributing factor. Certainly for the South American civilizations, they were wiped out mostly because of disasters like that. However, in the Middle East and Asia, there was warfare, and nuclear energy was involved. And when you get such a thing, it's not the less advanced nations, the third world countries, as we call them today, that would get wiped out so much. It would be the most advanced nations fighting each other that would wipe each other out.
Okay.
And of course, and then there's this cultural aspect that can destroy civilization as well. The Roman Empire was very sophisticated, and we've got many examples of this from the time of the Roman Empire. But when it disintegrated, the barbarians came from the north, and the Roman Empire just fell apart. Then other people arose up from the ruins of the empire, and in fact there was a religious organisation rose up which didn't want the knowledge that the rest of the world still retained after Rome lost it, and so they cut off connection between the east and the west, so that if you get as far as Istanbul, which was Constantinople then, beyond that, knowledge was kept at bay, so that Europe slid into the Dark Ages. And this is the reason for the Dark Ages in Europe, whereas other countries still continued on with much of their knowledge.
Just as a byproduct of what you're saying now, and this is a question I think I wanted to ask you the last time, what kind of knowledge do you think was lost in the fire at Alexandria?
1 million books have been destroyed in the Alexandrian library. And the Arab conquerors who took over Egypt actually didn't know what was in those books, or they would have been more careful, I think, because what we find is, I think there were several hundred swimming pools in Alexandria, if my memory is correct, and for 6 months these were heated with the books of the Alexandrian library.
Oh, dear.
The water was heated in the fires that warmed up the swimming pools.
Okay.
Terrible tragedy.
So we would have had
a wonderful library.
We would have had a completely different concept of ourselves historically and maybe even technologically had those books not been destroyed, more than likely.
You're absolutely right, David. I agree totally with you, what you just said.
Okay. Tell us a few more things about some of the, when you were out and you were, doing you were writing, say, your first book, Dead Men's Secrets, there must have been several things that you came upon that you just went, oh my goodness, it just must have taken you aback for a minute. Maybe you had to sit down and think about it for a second. Give us a few ideas of some of the things that may have taken you by surprise.
Oh, well, one was the tremendous medical advance and knowledge, the technology associated with medicine in the ancient world. We have, for example, X-rays, and these were not just in China. They were in a number of places where a person's body would be put in front of this machine, and it would show up the inside of their body and where any problems were.
Amazing.
So we today would call those X-ray machines.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
We also have over in the Americas, off the coast of Florida, big blocks of stone that were thrown into the ocean, and they've been brought up, some of them, and they've been used in modern construction around the seacoast, and they include big blocks which show drill holes through them, but the drill holes are not circular. The drill holes are star-shaped. So you've got a star going right through hard rock from one side to the other. Now, however on earth did they do that?
Wow.
Because drills go in a circle.
Yeah. That kind of boggles the mind to think about. Okay. And give us another example.
Well, we have, talking about drills, we go to Egypt and we find that around the pyramids, there are stones which have been drilled in ancient times when they were put into place, and modern engineers swear that the drills had to have been rotating 500 times faster than our modern drills can ever do.
Well, they would certainly need some kind of electrical impulses to make that happen.
Without electricity, I don't think they could have done it.
Yeah, I don't know how they could have done that either. Jonathan, let's leave the Earth and go to the skies. The moon. Now, did the Chinese go to the moon?
Well, the Chinese were not noted for their fiction. Unlike the Sumerians, they would only write facts, nothing else. And this was decreed by a Chinese emperor very early in their history, that no historian would ever be permitted to write fiction or he would lose his head. So you can be sure they were pretty careful.
Okay, yeah, I would think so. So
now, the Chinese recorded in a number of places in their writings the fact of voyages to the moon.
Whoa.
And they not only record voyages to the moon, but they describe craft that could land on the sea, go under the water, fly in the sky, or fly to the moon. They also describe what the Earth looks like from the moon. They describe the surface of the moon exactly like astronauts have described it in our day. This is in the Chinese writings.
How old are these writings?
These writings go back to about 300 BC, 2,300 years ago.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting, talking about the moon, they call it desolate, cold, and glassy. Now, the Emperor Yayo had an engineer who wanted to go to the moon. This was the year 2309. And he said that he travelled in the celestial bird, and this provided him with navigation information on his trip, so he knew exactly where he was going and how to get there. And he mounted first on the current of luminous air. That's the exhaust of a fiery rocket, maybe. And he said he flew into space where he did not perceive the rotary movement of the sun. Now that's a very important statement, because it corroborates his story, in the fact that man cannot see the sun rise or set when you leave the Earth.
Okay. Yeah, so how would he know to say that? Yeah, how would he know to say that unless he had actually experienced it, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And on the moon, he says, he saw the frozen-looking horizon and erected a building which he called the Palace of Cold. He and his team erected a building known as the Palace of Cold. Now, you might say, why would he call it the Palace of Cold? Because he said the temperature was very cold there.
Wow. Okay, that's astounding right there. That's really an astounding bit of news. Okay, let's leave that, go to the black satellite.
Right. Now, that's something that has perhaps been one of the most fantastic things you can imagine. The black satellite was not found until around about the time when the Russians put up their Sputnik and then the Americans put up their orbiting satellite. October 1957. This is when Sputnik 1 went up. And it went to 584 miles above the Earth. And of course the whole world was excited. There was a lot of disbelief because only just about 10 years before, one of the world's leading space scientists has said we'll never ever be able to do this. It's physically impossible. Well, within 10 years it was done. And people began to glimpse the shining artificial moon skimming across its path from east to west against the stars. And only 4 months later, America did the same. Now, this is when this discovery came, and it was hushed up pretty quickly. As the tracking station swung into action to monitor these 2 new man-made moons encircling the Earth, the night sky tossed up quite a mystery. There was another satellite found already in orbit. It was not American, it was not Russian, and no one else except America or Russia had the technology in our day. Now, a French astronomer, Jacques Vallée of the Paris Observatory, saw it 3 times in 1961. He got 11 data points on it in 45 seconds, and he concluded that it was orbiting in reverse, North Pole to South Pole, at an altitude not of 500 or 600 miles above the Earth, but 22,000 miles above the Earth.
Oh.
You can imagine how the experts were jolted by that.
Yeah.
And the interesting fact about this is that it was not until I began researching for the takeover book, which cancelled the other book, Dead Men's Secrets, that I began to discover references to Earth orbiting satellites in the writings of the ancient races.
Now, okay, there's a couple of things, and this could take a much longer conversation, even what we have left in terms of time. But now, the Indus Valley civilizations were pretty clear in their writings about the Vimanas. What do you feel about them?
Oh yes, most certainly. And if you compare the Indus Valley writings with the Indian writings, you'll notice that these Vimanas are given where there's instruction books written, which are now being translated, have been translated, and they're being looked at in American universities here and there, as well as universities in some other countries. And there are instruction books on how to construct a Vimana and how to avoid collisions in midair with other Vimanas. And some of these so-called Vimanas, whatever we want to give them a name, could contain up to 300 passengers. We have this in these old writings going way, way back about 3,000 or 4,000 years.
Wow. Now, the thing that I find the hardest to understand in all of this is it seems like to me this could be more easily grasped if these civilizations existed 12,000 years ago or maybe 15, because then it would seem like, okay, well, here's a long enough period to lose all that technological knowledge in. And for it to get lost in, you've got 15,000 years. Okay, well, it can go somewhere. But you're according to you, this is maybe just 3,000 years BC, 2,000 years BC. That's not very long. That's just, a page flip, in the history of the Earth. So I find that to me, it makes it a little less plausible. But, I mean, we certainly can, no matter how we date these things, they obviously existed for these people.
Yes, they did, and I believe that we can make this, we can understand this perhaps a little more realistically if we give a hypothetical example of something that might happen in our own day, perhaps, if it did ever happen in our own day.
Okay.
Just suppose, for a moment, the awful possibility that your hometown, David, or mine, was forever wiped off the map. Just imagine, what would future generations find? Now, let's look at our big skyscrapers.
Mm-hmm.
What are they today but just facades supported by thin tendons of steel?
Mm-hmm.
Now, even with no disaster, our main cities would be little more than rubble in 1,000 years from now. Look at our motorways. There'd be crumpled pieces of hardness underneath vegetation, because trees grow quickly again.
Yeah.
And our once complex railway network would be red dust blowing in the wind.
Mm-hmm.
What about the suburbs? Well, few house chattels would survive the corrosion of time. Generally, paper books can't last more than a few centuries. That's why we have to recopy them. Plastics will eventually disintegrate when exposed for long periods outside. And everything metallic would disintegrate and be destroyed. Hair dryers, automobiles, carpets, photographic plates and film, and what's more, all iron and steel skyscrapers would rust and crumble to earth. Nothing would be left except a few stone structures downtown and maybe a few statues.
Mm-hmm.
Because stone is the only indestructible material. It will survive a dead civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it ironic? Nature allows dressed blocks of stone to survive, but not thick iron girders.
Mm. Right.
And so you might go out to where the suburbs used to be, and what you'll find, only what you'll ever find will be an odd stone axe head. You won't find anything else that our civilization had. Toasters, X-ray machines, transistors, television sets, all these would just be legends, nothing more.
Okay. And that could happen, you're saying, in the space of 1,000 years or less?
Or less, yeah. I'm just saying 1,000 years to give it a lot more time.
Right. Let me ask you, let's go back to the black satellite for a minute, because I got away from that without asking you one question. How do you think it got there? What is your theory of that black satellite? And is it still there?
Yeah, sure. It's still there.
Okay.
In fact, it's been cited hundreds of times now. Others have given reports and still continue to do so. And I was speaking to somebody in the United States who's very close into intelligence, and he has spoken to me on the phone and also emailed me about it. He said that he has been told not to try to he's been trying to get this made public. He's been told not to make waves if he values his life.
Oh dear. So
now that's trying to get details about it, but generally speaking, we can talk about it so long as we don't try to get too deep. But let's put it this way. It's up there still. A lot of people have seen it. A lot of scientists are probably still tracking it. There was a desire of one group to go out there, to get up there somehow and see if they could get inside it. To my knowledge, that has not been done, although I can't be certain. However, there's a huge swath of secrecy over it.
Yeah, very huge. Yeah, very huge.
Yeah. So there's a number of things that we try to investigate.
Yeah. Yeah. The question is, how did it get there? The question is, was it put there? I mean, do you believe at all in extraterrestrial races involving themselves in the growth of this or assisting humankind in its growth, or even evolving itself at all in this planet?
No, as a general statement, I would say no, I don't.
Okay.
Everything that we have evidence for shows man-made origins.
So then this black satellite then would have been something that would have been put up by the ancient races as opposed to being put up by an extraterrestrial race, is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. I'm totally convinced of that because of my research into the ancient civilizations and what they wrote about and what they said they were doing.
Oh, okay. All right, so that's pretty amazing within itself then that they would have the technology to put something 2,200 miles above the Earth. That's absolutely amazing. All right, so now let's talk a little bit. Let me go back to something that you said earlier, and you said that in the beginning, and I would assume this is because of your research, that the civilizations that were here devolved from a belief in one deity to a belief in many. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. Perhaps I'll give an example from everyday life. Man starts off with, say, 10 laws, and then he starts every day, every month, every year, man adds to those laws, and he keeps on adding until there are tens of thousands of laws ruling one nation. We know that happens. Man keeps adding all the time. Now, when it came to the original writings of all the civilizations, they all speak of one God. Even the Hindus, they spoke of one God, one single God, a creator God who made the earth. Now, as they began to add heroes to it's an interesting story how this developed. Most of the gods that were added were virtually human beings in real life who were honoured for something they'd done for their community, and after their death they were revered more as honourable people who lived in a better time. But human nature being what it is, they began to add to the attainments of these once human beings, and they elevated them by saying, well, this man's spirit has gone up to the stars.
Well, I have to say this. No, I'm sorry to cut you off, but you're making a point that I feel like I have to just throw this in there because the Catholic Church is about ready to what is the word? Beatify another Pope, I think John Paul II. And it seems to be that certainly illustrates what you're saying, that they take, even in terms of how the church itself has taken exemplary citizens or extraordinary people in service to the church and relegated them to the status of saints. And once they are saints for, say, a couple, 50, 60, 70 years, for most people, they may as well be praying to God. So that sort of does illustrate your point.
This is the very same thing that happened through history, yes. Until eventually one god worshipped in India is now something like 60,000 gods, all different, all taking care of certain aspects of people's lives, as it were, so that when they deified human beings, first of all, the first step was to honour them. The second step was to say their spirit had gone up to the sky. The third step was to identify them with a star or with a planet so that that person actually became a planet. Now, when we talk about Nibiru was a Sumerian human being hero. He was a well-known hero in Sumeria. And ultimately, he was deified, and he was identified with the planet Jupiter. So the planet Jupiter was called Nibiru sometimes.
Okay.
Now,
well, that's very interesting and certainly very different from the main line of thinking, but it's always good to have the other alternatives there to keep the mind from getting too trapped in certain things. Go ahead, please.
Yes, and then they began to look up those stars and say, well, these stars can influence us and help us. These people were once nobles who helped the human race, so that star, that planet can be of help to us. And this is how astrology developed. And then they thought, well, we need someone to help us when we're travelling. We need someone to help us when we're fishing. We need someone to help us when we're sowing our crops and so on. We need someone to help us in battle. And so various stars and heavenly bodies, which were originally human beings in their thinking, began to be dedicated to that particular job of helping people. And this is how they've been proliferating year after year, even in our day.
Okay. All right. Well, that's certainly a very interesting take on and a different take, but one that, it may well help some people to understand a little bit more, how people have sort of developed in terms of starting off with the monotheistic approach, and then gradually it becoming, many more gods that people worship. We certainly are seeing the same examples today, so we can't certainly say that it didn't happen that way. Now, in terms of something that we had mentioned the last time, and I think that, we were just getting into it when we actually had to end the show due to technical difficulties, and when you were talking about stuff being dumped into the Atlantic Ocean. You remember that?
Yes. You're speaking of artifacts, artifacts being dumped into the sea, yes.
Yes. Talk about that for a little bit so that people can understand the lengths to which certain things are being hidden.
Yes, well, there's a magazine in Australia, a good friend of mine, Duncan Rhodes, runs it. It's called Nexus Magazine. I don't know if you have an American in the shops or not.
Yes, we do, yeah.
Right. And Duncan and somebody that was writing for him uncovered the fact that the Smithsonian Institute, now the Smithsonian is dedicated to public dissemination of knowledge for the world. But it's been taken over by a group of men in recent years who are more intent on protecting a theory that's also around us. And so anything that they're given that seems to threaten or put that theory at risk is put down in the basements. It's hidden or lost. Lost is deliberately lost, or else it is. It has been, on one occasion at least, loaded up on a boat, a whole lot of these things, loaded up on a boat and dumped in the Caribbean Sea.
That's really amazing.
The story.
That is really amazing. I just want to say to our listeners again, please feel free to call in. This is your time to call in and ask your own questions. I'm sure as you're listening to this conversation that certain things are crossing your mind, and if I don't ask them and you want to hear them, you're going to have to be the one to call in and ask them. How much do you think it would change things if people really knew what the past was like and what's being hidden from them?
Oh, it would make a big change, and I believe it would be a change for the better. Today, unfortunately, and I write about this in my book, so I might as well mention it on air, we are taught a theory that man has come from an ignoble past, from a muddy past, as some microbe in the slime, and that he has gradually developed to where he is now, and that each human being is an accident. We're all accidents. We're here by accident, and that we, in the views of those who are now planning for the world's future and are getting a very tight control, most people on this planet are simply of no value, but they're useless eaters who are expendable. Now, Hitler adopted that theory. So did Stalin. So did Pol Pot. So did Mao in China. And as a result, 100 million people were slaughtered over the last century just because of that theory. Mm. Now, that's a dangerous theory in my mind, and we've got to get rid of it. And a revised history will show us that our ancestors were dignified people. They were people who were very intelligent, and we're descended from them, and every one of us has value.
Now, and I appreciate you saying that, because that's something that everybody needs to hear and everybody needs to understand, is the value of their own individuality and how much it is worth. Now, this is something that you do cover, I believe. I don't know if it's in Dead Men's Secrets, but you do cover this very interesting tale or legend about the caves. And in the caves, there are drawings of people wearing modern clothing. Now, tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, we're taught that cave people were primitives, and that they were just evolving from savagery. This is what the popular view is, as we all know. Now, wherever we want to go, let's go to West Borneo, for example, in Indonesia. There's a network of caves. You can go there. They're hollowed out like a cathedral, like a great cathedral under the sky, and within them, fabrics of extreme fineness and delicacy, which have been produced on a loom, on a machine that makes clothing, was found in the cave, which was inhabited by these so-called savages. We go to the caveman art, and if you go to Spain, to Altamira, for example, you will find paintings there inside that cave as good as modern paintings.
And they're made how long ago do they date back to?
There's writing in the caves also, which is almost identical to the writing of the Sumerian people of about 1000 BC. At the very earliest, 2000 BC, the scripts that we're finding in these old caves is like the scripts found in the civilizations of 2000 to 1000 BC. So these caves are contemporary.
That's really, really interesting. We have a caller, and I want to make sure that we give him an opportunity to ask his question. I believe it's Will from Pennsylvania, one of my favorite people. Let's see what Will has to say. 1 second. Jonathan, I think I just lost my screen. Let's go back for a second. Let's see if we can get this. There we go. Okay, Will, how are you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay, I'd like to ask Jonathan a question. Recently, I received in the email that there was a U.S. led search team by a professor from University of Hartford, Connecticut, who is saying that he's found, or he believes he's found, the submerged city of Atlantis north of a place, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, called Cadiz, Spain, buried at Dona Ana Park. And I was wondering if Jonathan knew anything about this, or if he thought that this has anything to do with Atlantis.
Jonathan.
Oh, yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. It's interesting that over the last 20 years, I have been noticing reports much like this one, exciting reports, but the Atlantis that's being found there, it might be 1,000 miles from the Atlantis found elsewhere in the Atlantic, or over in the Caribbean Sea, for example, or in the Mediterranean. We're hearing so many wonderful reports of lost cities that are drowned cities, and that they all exist. Every one of them is real. But to identify it with Atlantis, of course, is a different matter.
Okay, I see. Can I ask last question before I go?
Please.
I'd like to ask Jonathan, what do you think of I believe, what do they call it, the Bimini Wall?
The Bimini Wall, yes, a very straight wall, man-made definitely, not natural accident, and it's conformable to other walls found under the ocean as well, which definitely were constructed when the land that's now submerged was above sea level. There's been a lot of rising and falling of land over the centuries, and just like the Bimini Wall, I think it's something like 200 or more cities around the coastlines of the world are submerged that are now known. So I would think earthquakes have done a lot of this. It's not all the rising of the sea level, but earthquakes as well.
Okay. Okay, listen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for calling in.
Okay, bye.
All right. Bye-bye. So, let's just come back over to the Grand Canyon for a minute and G.E. Kincaid and his expedition into the Grand Canyon. And now that area of the Grand Canyon has been closed off to hikers. From what I understand, even the park people themselves really don't frequent it a lot. But that area of the canyon has Egyptian names, Temple of Osiris or Isis, also Hindu names as well. And then G.E. Kincaid claimed to have found this cave in which there were, I think, Egyptian / Far Eastern artifacts. Do you feel that that's a valid legend?
Yes, I do. I certainly do. The newspaper report is a genuine report. There's no reason. In fact, let me put it this way: the policy that archaeologists normally follow is to believe an ancient report or to believe any written record unless there's good reason to dispute it. Mm-hmm. And there is no good reason that I know of to dispute the newspaper report as not being genuine. Firstly, we're dealing with a report that named, it was published at the time when the event is supposed to have happened. The people are real people. The locations are real locations. We're looking here at also a Smithsonian man who, Kincaid, being on a Smithsonian expedition, and I've had an email from the grandson of a gentleman who apparently was alive at the time, and the email stated that this man was present when artifacts from that cave were sent across, when they were shipped across to the Smithsonian in the eastern states. You go there today or you contact them today, they don't know anything about it. Now, this to me is typical of what goes on with certain organisations who are now renowned for their cover-ups.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, the fact that, I certainly know growing up in school here in the United States, you have a certain history of the country, and when I first picked up a magazine that even hinted that Egyptians were over here or that the Phoenicians were over here or even the Hebrews were over here, I was a little shocked. I mean, I'm a fan of ancient history, so I felt a little offended, really. I was just like, whoa, I've grown up all my life, and all you mean to tell me this has been happening, and this happened, and I've been led to believe that, it wasn't until 1492 or whatever that all of a sudden this new land was discovered. Meanwhile, people have been coming here all the time and leaving artifacts behind. So it does really make a difference, I think, in how a human being perceives itself, if that person has a clearer idea of what's going on before it, So this news obviously is pretty interesting. Are there any other cities or anything that you think might be here in the Americas that maybe people don't know about that maybe they should be more aware of?
Well, there's a half covered up area in Texas where with huge walls like the walls of the city that has been reported from time to time. It's never been excavated, but there could be well worth an expedition right there in the United States and Texas to zero in on that spot and perhaps start digging deeper. And the walls that have been seen go down very, very deep into the ground. So there could have been something rather big there. I can't give the actual location because I'm just remembering something that I've studied earlier, but I've got it documented here somewhere in my office. And I can give details.
Do you think that North America would have had maybe itself as grand a civilization as the Mayans or the Incas at some particular point in time?
Oh, yes. In Canada and in Mexico, there are reports of a great civilization that was wiped out between them. In other words, to the Canadians, it was south of Canada. To the Mexicans, it was north of Mexico.
Okay.
And what country lies between them?
Well, there you go. Okay. Good old US of A. Uh-huh. Well, that's some interesting bit of information. Well, go ahead. You were going to say more. Sorry.
Yes, actually, in the Death Valley region, early explorers in the 1800s left behind documentation of their visits and stated, a number of them, that there appeared to have been a great city near is it the Gila River, Gila?
Okay, that works.
Between the Gila River and the Death Valley main region, and that this city appeared to have, the streets were still, the outlines of the streets were still there, and one of them mentioned a particular building that he came across that looked as though it had been melted from above.
Oh, so now we have another radiation situation. Wow.
And we have a report from Canada that a civilization was destroyed from the air by another civilization.
So, I mean, I think yeah.
A civilization in America, and the Death Valley area does appear to be a focal point of something in the past.
Well, you know, having the name Death Valley itself almost seems symbolic of something coming from out of that, you know, of something having been there that had, you know, died almost. I mean, I'm sure the name comes from maybe just the, you know, the aridness of the land and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but maybe there was even more to it than just that. Okay, this is really some fascinating stuff that we've been talking about because it really appears that the human race had a very advanced history, one that we're not really used to hearing when we read the books, of course. I think you were the one that mentioned in either in our last interview or whatever of the caveman, you know, knocking the woman over the head with the club and dragging her off to the cave, something that I think we tend to think of. We see the pictures of the involvement of the human man, of the human being from the ape through the different stages, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, blah, 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 et cetera, or vice versa. I'm not exactly sure which one is which. And then bam, here we are, a modern man, when in actuality, somehow in the very beginning of time, and I'm not exactly sure what your theory is on this, though, but we were indeed a very advanced race. I mean, my question would be, if you don't feel that it was the extraterrestrials that came in and gave us the jump start, how did we get there on our own? It would be my question.
Okay, and this is where we get into my new book, where I prove from genetics that we had to have been man's intelligence, man's life, intelligence and personality. The law of cause and effect, which is an established scientific law, states that the effect cannot be greater than the cause. That's quite scientific. Now, for us to have life and personality and intelligence would require a source that had life, intelligence and personality outside time and space, creating what we have become. In other words, we are a product, a very clever product of an intelligent source that has personality like we do, because we are not greater than the source that gave us life. That's my...
Yes, that makes absolute sense. I'm sorry if I'm cutting across you here because what you're saying.
No, that's fine.
I'm feeling obligated to jump in because you're saying things that I really can identify with. Okay, so this is in your books, Forbidden Secrets. Is that the book that covers that?
Yes, the Forbidden Secret. The first few chapters of Forbidden Secret cover that, and I'm getting reports back from people who were very sceptical about that very idea, who now say that this is compelling. So the evidence is compelling once we get into it.
Let's talk a little bit about your other books. Tell us a little bit about what's in them. The Lost World of Giants. This actually gives, I think it's 99 examples of giants in the ancient world. I didn't quite reach the 100. I don't know why. I usually try to reach the acme of perfection. But there's 99, and there's plenty there, and there's a few photographs showing that ancient man was large. In fact, the scientific world today, even Charles Darwin admitted that the fossil record shows that men and animals and trees and plants were much larger than they are today, the same kinds. I mean, sheep were as big as horses, for example. Mm-hmm. And everything was much larger in the early world before the Great Flood, and the Great Flood explains the change of environment, which would bring about everything decreasing in size. But it was not just a flood, it was a cosmic disaster. And there are still large people on the earth, but nothing like we used to be. Well, how big did we used to be?
Well, skeletons have been found. I mean, I've got a friend working in Ecuador. He's a Czech scientist. He's working in Ecuador with the government, which is a rarity. And he's found 12-foot skeletons. I think he's talking now about 20-foot skeletons, so man was pretty big in the past. Okay,
that's exciting. That's from The Lost World of Giants. The Weapons the Globalists Fear.
The Weapon the Globalist Fear is the book that is exposing the fact that we are created beings and we're not an accident of evolution. And that is the book of Genesis. It's the most hotly attacked and contested book on the face of planet Earth. And that particular book, I've gone through all the scientific statements in the book of Genesis that show it's the earliest and most accurate scientific book we've had in history.
Okay, I can see why that would cause some problems for some, and for some people who are maybe more theologically oriented, you would think that they would accept that. That might still cause problems for them too. So I could understand why that book would be high up on the list of books that have been attacked and feared. And 64 Secrets still ahead of us.
That deals with, in Dead Men's Secrets, I catalogue more than 1,000 secrets of the ancient races, technological and knowledge that was more advanced than later, and which we're rediscovering today. Well, these 64 secrets are knowledge from the past that is still ahead of our day.
Okay. So everybody that's listening right now, and for the archive listeners as well, when you tune in, Jonathan Gray, our guest today, has some books out there that I think will really pique your interest in our history, give you an opportunity to explore areas of thought concerning the origins of mankind, of the technology that we had in the past, certainly things that you're not going to get in your normal history books at all. And I would certainly advise you to at least go to his website, which is beforeus.com. Is that not correct, Jonathan?
That's correct, beforeus.com.
Beforeus.com. We're really happy that we managed to have an opportunity to talk with you today without all of the technical difficulties and get all these questions in and get a clearer understanding of your perspective, your theories about the planet and about the technological achievements that we had on this planet, which are real. They are real. So, Jonathan, I just want to thank you for being a guest on our show. If you just want to hang out a little bit to the other side of the ending, we can say goodbye then. But I would like
down to the south. There's evidence that one Egyptian explorer came back from the southern hemisphere to Egypt and brought an animal that was able to hop around. It was a kangaroo. And the Egyptians recorded this.
Where is this information recorded?
It's recorded actually on some of the monuments of the tombs of different pharaohs. Events such as this is just one event, recorded by the pharaohs of events during their lifetime.
Ah, okay. So now, all right, so let's talk a bit about the Egyptians then. What else can you tell us about what was going on in terms of the Egyptians technologically? Because, I mean, they created, of course, that they built the pyramids. Now, do you believe that they built the pyramids? And do you believe that the pyramids were built with slave labor, people dragging the blocks along up ramps?
Well, it's interesting that yes and no. The latter part of Egyptian history, after the technology deteriorated, we have evidence of pyramids being built in a more primitive method. We actually have that on the walls of one of the pharaohs who wrote what was happening in his day, and that was a much smaller pyramid, very, very small. But there's evidence that the Egyptians were aware of sound waves and that they recorded that the huge lifting of mighty blocks was done not with slaves, not with pulleys, not with ramps, but rather by the use of sound waves. And sound wave technology was apparently something that was global in its knowledge in the past. Egypt was just one country that used it.
Yes, I've heard about that before, actually. I mean, that I've heard about, and that would certainly account for a lot of the huge monolithic structures, the huge stones like at Baalbek and also down in South America as well, that are weigh tons and tons that we could not even possibly lift today. Now, this is the thing. because I know that from what I understand, from what I've read, and from maybe part of our conversation before, how did we get so advanced and then end up devolving so? I mean, where did this knowledge come from?
Well, it's very interesting. In my research, I was struck by the similarity between Egyptian civilization, the Indus Valley civilization in what is today Pakistan, and in the Sumerian civilization in what is now Iraq. And it's interesting that these three civilizations suddenly appeared out of nowhere. In each case, there's no indication of evolving from a primitive beginning. But in the case of Egypt, in particular, which we're talking about right now, and it's true of the others as well, the highest technology and the highest scientific knowledge was at the beginning, not later. It did not develop from there. Therefore, it does suggest that the fact that these civilizations began round about the same time as each other, they suddenly sprang up, the three of them, suggests they had a common what shall we say, trigger that triggered the rise of these civilizations. Now, when we get to the...
What would that trigger be? Would you have any theory or idea within yourself as to what that trigger would have been?
Yes, I certainly do now. And I believe it can be substantiated, David, that there was a great disaster, that worldwide civilizations globally had a memory of what they called the Great Flood. In fact, it's the most widespread memory of the human race. We've got over 600 reports handed down independently across the world of this event. Now, they all state that it was global, that most of the human race was wiped out, and that it began again. The Middle East was the re-establishment point of the New World. And this would account for Egypt, Sumeria, and Indus Valley being the closest to that centre and being the first civilizations to arise after the disaster. But of course, they couldn't just arise. You'd need enough people. It would take a few generations, several hundred years, before there were enough people, no matter what knowledge they had preserved, before they could establish a culture. It takes people to do it, even if you've got the knowledge. One family couldn't do it on their own.
Now, that civilization, that antediluvian civilization, are you one of the believers in Atlantis? Do you believe it was Atlantis, or do you believe it came from somewhere else? And where do you believe Atlantis was?
Well, Atlantis, what I do accept, of course, is that where there is smoke, there's fire. Where there's a legend, there has to be a core of truth.
Okay.
And
good way to look
some
at it.
people call it Atlantis. And we do have a story about a place called Atlantis, which came to us fourth hand. It was not a first-hand report. And during that handing down, I do believe that a lot of details became garbled, and there were changes made to the story. And one of these changes was the length of time between the report and the alleged event. Now, also another change was the size of Atlantis. I'm open, actually, as I know a lot of other researchers who are looking at all the facts are open to the fact that Atlantis could be either pre-flood or post-flood, depending upon how you interpret the story.
Well, if it's post-flood, if it's post-flood, then that means we have to still find a civilization that was pre-flood. So, I mean, in order for all of the, because, I mean, I know that a lot of people do feel that, we had the extraterrestrial jump start, and I know a lot of people don't. But my question would simply be, where would all of this advancement, this advanced technology, where would this knowledge come from?
That's a very good question. We have the oldest record of the pre-flood world is in the book of Genesis. A lot of people, of course, don't believe the book of Genesis, but archaeological research is confirming it as literally acceptable. And in the book of Genesis, it states that there was an industrial revolution which took place about 300 years before the great disaster.
Okay.
And that not only was metallurgy mastered, but also there were schools of metallurgy. And there was a very high civilization wiped out at the time of the Great Flood.
Okay. And so that's great civilization then migrated into various places. You said the Indus Valley, Sumeria, of course, Egypt, and then they would have somehow ended up in the Americas as the Mayans and the Olmecs as well, I would suppose. That
is right, yes. From the Middle East, they went west, and they found the Americas at a very early stage.
Okay. Interesting. Now, all right, so let's go back to the Egyptians again. So now we have these high civilizations, and apparently very high. Give me examples. Now, we talked just a little bit already about Egypt. Let's cover a few more examples of their superior technology, just to give a clear indication to our listeners as to how technologically advanced they were than us.
Well, yes. For example, here's something that we have by inference rather than by evidence, but I think it's so interesting and it's so valid that we ought to mention it first.
Okay.
Whenever you go into the old buildings of medieval Europe, you see smoke on the ceilings of these buildings, the ones that are still standing. And this is naturally because smoke sources for light were used, lamps, oil lamps or candles and so on.
Right.
Now today we don't have that. You look up your ceiling where you are now, and I and mine, and we use electric lights, and we don't have smoke on the ceilings. It's
right.
a non-smoking source of light. You go to the older buildings in not just Egypt but Asia and other places, and you will find the oldest places where there is evidence that man has lived and where he's painted beautiful paintings, particularly in Egypt, where they go inside mountains and places where sunlight could never reach. But you would need something like sunlight to execute these beautiful paintings. You couldn't do it any other way. And there's no smoke on the ceilings. No smoke whatsoever.
We're talking... Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, this does tell us that they had a smokeless source of light.
And not even caverns. I don't even want to use that word. I want to use the word rooms. And tunnels that are hundreds of rooms and tunnels many, many feet beneath the earth. Are we not talking about places like that?
Oh, yes, we certainly are. And mirrors have been... modern researchers have tried to use reflection by a series of mirrors from daylight into the interiors, but it's not adequate. It doesn't work.
I couldn't even imagine it working. International world-famous archaeologist, explorer, and author. He has traveled the world to gather data on ancient mysteries and published more than 30 books and videos, written several hundred papers, hosted newspaper columns, appeared on numerous television and radio shows worldwide, and lectures to audiences on every continent. Over the past 37 years, he has penetrated some largely unexplored areas, including parts of the Amazon headwaters. He has also led expeditions to the bottom of the sea and to remote mountain and desert regions of the world. His findings include evidence of ancient Egyptians in the Americas, remains of ancient giants on a remote Pacific island, and of Egyptian chariot parts and skeletal remains scattered over the seabed. Now, this approach has propelled him to the forefront of little-known discoveries that shake traditional theories of our past. In the course of his explorations, Jonathan began to uncover evidence of surprising out-of-place artifacts that should not exist. These artifacts were found on a global pattern, and they suggest an ancient worldwide civilization of astonishing proportions. His book, Dead Men's Secrets, catalogs more than 1,000 pieces of evidence of a lost super science and technology, including dozens of achievements ahead of our day. His other books include Lost World of Giants, The Weapon the Globalist Fear, and 64 Secrets Still Ahead of Us. and I understand that his new book, The Forbidden Secret, is in the production stages and is actually available in that part of the world, which is, I think, New Zealand and Australia, and will soon be available around the rest of the world as well and available on the internet. Jonathan, thank you very much for agreeing to come on at such short notice and be our guest again on The Bright Side. How are you, sir?
Very, very well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have you back. I don't know how many of the people listening heard the original interview, so we're just going to start again from scratch. And one of the things I really want to start with is, now, you've been doing this for 37 years, and of course, I suppose as all the rest of us, you know, you've been given a traditional history of the world and how we started off as cavemen and then how we gradually advanced into modern technologies, the industrial age, etc. But something along the lines, when you were studying archaeology, something changed your perception of that and got you started off on your road. Can you take us back to that point?
Yes, I'll be happy to. As I researched, it took me to over 30 countries, and I began to see things that I'd never even heard about, which should not even exist. And the first one, I just pushed it aside, thought, well, this is an anomaly. It can't be explained at this moment, but maybe one of these days. But the more I researched, the more of these out-of-place artifacts and out-of-place evidences began to surface, until it became quite an avalanche. It was impossible to keep pushing these aside and still be honest with the evidence I was dealing with. So I stopped what I was doing. That book was cancelled totally, and I had to start from scratch, and I realised now that the world had to hear about this because it would place a completely different slant upon all of the history we'd been taught.
Let me ask you a question. That first book that you were starting on that you had to scrap, what was that going to be about?
It was going to be a traditional history book, but a history of the civilizations of the world.
No kidding. Wow. Okay. And you decided it. Now, when you took that trip into the Amazon, I believe, the first trip that you took, was that during the course of writing the book? Was that afterwards? Or
that was before.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't place much value upon what I saw in the Amazon at that time in relation to what I'm doing now, because I was not expecting it to have any value. What I did see was Egyptian metal hieroglyphics, metal plates, or a metal plate to start with, more came up later, but a metal plate with Egyptian hieroglyphics on it, which had been traded across the Atlantic Ocean to native tribes that now inhabited the Amazon. And so this was evidence, really, and as I mentioned, I didn't really think about it too much at the time, but later when I began to find these other anomalies cropping up, I realised then the significance of this, that Egyptians had actually visited South America and traded with the South Americans long ago, when South Americans had shining cities, and before their ancestors actually had to go bush through earthquakes and so on, and today their descendants still hold these relics.
So, okay, so now the Egyptians were actually navigating the oceans of the world. How long ago was this?
It would be around about 2000 BC to probably 1500 BC.
That's not very long ago. I mean, is there any evidence? Because, I mean, I certainly know from my understanding of ancient history that there's nothing written in the history books that would give us any indication to believe that the Egyptians traveled that far.
No, that's very true. Our knowledge of Egyptian history goes back probably to 1000 BC. Our clear knowledge of the Egyptian history is not that clear. But then the history book, History of Egypt, is the type of history that we read about after Egypt had lost its highest technology and after many of the secrets of pyramid building and electrical matters and so on were lost. We have evidence that the Egyptians had a very high civilization, much higher than what's taught in the history books. But we're dealing in the history books today with, in the school history books and university books, with the latter history of Egypt, not the earlier history. That was more sophisticated.
Okay, so you say the Egyptians traveled, and so then if they came as far as South America, then they must have probably as well landed in North America, you think?
Oh, yes, most likely they did. In fact, I believe there's good evidence that has been found in North America of Egyptian presence. And also they went